Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I am very excited to share with you Tabitha's story. It is the second story in the Harborview romance series of short stories inspired by my trip to Boston with my dear friend Stephanie Fowers. It was also inspired by you. I released the first story last week and asked if it was something that you were all interested in, and the comments and the messages that I received told me that you were. So without any hesitation, I jumped into writing this book, and I am so excited to share it with you. It is not a full-length novel. It is a short story, so it shouldn't take you very long to listen, but I hope you enjoy Tabitha and Daniel's story, and I'll see you on the other side.
Chapter 1. The chatter of eager students and the shuffle of small feet in the schoolyard followed me as I entered the red brick building in anticipation of starting my day. The three-story brick schoolhouse stood tall in the bustling South End neighborhood of Harborview. Its white window frames and black shutters contrasted sharply with the ruddy brick walls, faded and worn from decades of harsh New England weather. A small bell tower protruded from the slanted roof, topped with a modest bell that rang out loudly twice a day, signaling the start and end of lessons. Inside, the school smelled of slate, chalk dust, and the slight mustiness of old wood. Long beams of sunlight streamed through the tall, narrow windows into the cramped classrooms where rows of small desks filled the space. The wood floorboards creaked under the shuffling feet of children aged 6 to 14, dressed in frayed hand-me-down clothes that revealed the working-class clientele of the neighborhood. In the corner of each classroom a pot-bellied stove glowed with warmth to fight off the cold drafts of early spring. I unlocked my classroom door with the tick-iron key. Once inside, I breathed in the familiar scents, comforted by the childhood memories they evoked. Running my fingers over the smooth grain of the desks, I straightened the small bouquets of wildflowers several students had presented to me just yesterday. Their vibrant petals and heady fragrances perfectly captured spring's awakening. I sighed, dreading the arrival of our new headmaster. The children laughing and playing tag outside seemed blissfully unaware of the changes to come once the notorious Mr. Taylor arrived. I tidied the already orderly bookshelves, feeling the weight of uncertainty about whether I would even keep my position under the new regime. The current headmaster had been fair and kind, his door always open, in stark contrast to the rumors circulating about old Mr. Taylor. Some even whispered he had been run out of his last school in the city, landed here in Harborview only through some shady connections. The man headed our way was supposed to be ancient, bald as an egg, with spectacles as thick as a Bible and a frown to rival Ebenezer Scrooge. Tales of his strict methods and impatience with mumbling children reached my ears from teachers who had met colleagues from his last school. Would he strip the school of all warmth and joy? Would the sing-song voices of my students reciting their times tables soon turn silent under his critical glare? The uncertainty gnawed at my heart as I continued preparing the classroom, erasing the arithmetic problems from the board. I held out hope that the children might yet crack through his tough facade. Perhaps our little school could instill in him some small measure of enjoyment in teaching again. The giggling sounds of play outside promised the resilience of youth against temperaments of all kinds. If old Mr. Taylor banned dodgeball and tag, surely the students would find some other creative outlet when his gaze turned elsewhere. I paused at the windows overlooking the schoolyard. Outside, children laughed and played amidst budding trees. One towhead boy paused to inspect a fat robin tugging a worm from the soft earth. I smiled, warmed by their joy. This view had greeted me each morning for the past 3 years since returning to teach at my childhood school. My mother and her mother before her had also taught generations of Harborview youths within these brick walls. A carriage pulled up to the front gates. The elderly ABD beloved Dr. Campbell descended gingerly, one hand pressed to his lower back. For 30 years he had guided our close-knit community of educators and students. But yesterday he'd informed me and the other teachers of his imminent retirement and his replacement by a Daniel Taylor. My stomach nodded with anxiety. Dr. Campbell possessed decades of wisdom and patience, qualities I somehow doubted this newcomer shared. The carriage shifted, as a tall figure stepped down. Keen blue eyes set in a stern, clean-shaven face glanced through my window. I jerked back reflexively. Oh blast! I jumped toward the window again, cursing my reflexes for stealing my opportunity to get a good look at Mr. Taylor before he entered the building. I rushed around, making sure everything was in its place. Surely the new headmaster would tour the school and my classroom was the first one inside the main doors. Yes. Yes. Take a look around, Dr. Campbell's warbling tenor echoed down the hall. I have a couple last-minute things to see to before I hand over the keys. You'll enjoy Miss Winslow's room. The first one there. It's quite wonderful.
Aww.
That was nice of Dr. Campbell to say, I thought. I wished he could stay longer to help smooth the transition, but his health required him to move to a warmer climate. The local doctor advised him to not weather another New England winter. I hardly had time to bask in the compliment before the door creaked open. Swallowing my trepidation, I swept across the room just as the new headmaster filled the doorway. Dark hair framed angular features set with determination reminiscent of prow jutting through turbulent waters. He was not old, barely 5 years my senior if he was one. He was not bald, his slightly wavy locks were wonderful. He was, however, stern-looking. This man could captain wayward ships, or capsize them entirely. I mustered a gracious smile regardless. Mr. Taylor, welcome. I'm Tabitha Winslow. I held out my hand as I walked across the room, realizing too late that I'd started the gesture much too soon and looked like a lunatic with locked elbows lurching about. There was nothing to do for it except continue on, and so I did, my face heating from embarrassment. The man was not short and I had to crane my head back to look up at him. He did wear spectacles as was rumored, but they were respectable ones that added to his handsomeness by giving him a studious air that was troublingly attractive to me. His large hand engulfed mine and filled my entire arm with warmth that surged right to my toes. It was not a pleasant sensation as I wanted to pant and fan myself afterward. A pleasure, Miss Winslow. His tone implied anything but. Releasing me quickly, his piercing gaze swept the room. I see you take pride in your position, given the state of your classroom. I stood taller as I tried to observe the space through his eyes. Every corner was clean and the desks orderly. Yes, the children respond well to visual stimulation. I also allow them outlets for their creativity. He gestured towards the colorful mural covering one wall, a seascape featuring mermaids, sea creatures and pirates that I'd helped the children paint last year. The plaster had cracked and rather than miss an opportunity when it was repaired, I'd found a canvas for some of their more imaginative tales. His lip curled. An admirable diversion from proper learning, I'm sure. Irked by his thinly veiled criticism, I guided him towards our nature table displaying the students' flower bouquets, shells collected on seaside walks, and caterpillars housed in glass jars so students could watch their metamorphosis into butterflies. The natural sciences are another one of our focuses, as you can see from our collection. He merely frowned. While I commend your creativity, such activities stray from core curriculum. Time wasted, he murmured. Indignation flared. Had he ever tried to get a 6-year-old to read a science book? To be fair, neither had I. Instead, I taught a lesson and then encouraged them to find it in nature on their own. We discussed many areas of science, including things they would not cover until several years of study later, simply because they were curious. Before I could respond, the bell in our small tower rang and small bodies hurtled through the door chattering excitedly. I turned with genuine pleasure to embrace my beloved students in welcome. From the corner of my eye I noticed Mr. Taylor retreat towards the hall, suspicion heavy on his stern features. I felt equally wary of him. While committed to welcoming new leadership, I refused to stand by quietly if he threatened the open, nurturing environment I'd cultivated here over the years. My most rambunctious student, Tommy, suddenly rushed over. Miss Winslow, look. He opened his clasped hands to reveal a fat brown spider perched on his palm. I bit back the gasp. I caught him outside to show you. Can we keep him? Several girls shrieked while boys clustered around, clamoring for a glimpse. Before I could respond, a deep voice boomed behind me. Why is this girl on her desk? I turned to see Mr. Taylor looming in the doorway, pointing at Matilda. His outraged eyes fixed on poor Tommy. My protective instincts flared. Just an eager student sharing his find, Mr. Taylor. I gently cupped my hands around Tommy's smaller ones to make sure the spider, a common garden variety, didn't escape. Would you kindly return this brave fellow outside? This is not an insect we can keep inside. Thank you so much for showing him to me. Tommy grinned up at me. Yes, Miss Winslow. He raced past Mr. Taylor, who pressed himself against the doorframe as if Tommy would throw the spider on him. I half hoped he would, and that Mr. Taylor would squeal and climb on the desk next to Matilda, who was now sitting on said desk with her feet on her chair. I motioned for her to hop down, and she did so without protest while I herded children towards their desks. Mr. Taylor remained by the door, arms crossed. I hope you plan to handle such disruptions more decisively in future, Miss Winslow. His voice carried across the room, and the children slowed or stopped, staring at him with varying degrees of mistrust and curiosity. He ignored them in his attempt to stare me down. Children require structure, clear rules, and a firm hand in discipline. Anger tightened my ribcage, and the air between us crackled with challenge. I stood tall and lifted my chin, ready to give him a dressing down on what I thought of that statement. Before my brilliantly worded retort escaped my lips, a tug at my sleeve drew my attention. Young Sarah, a girl so shy she put deer to shame, stared up at me with anxious eyes. She was incredibly empathetic and in tune with others. If someone fell in the schoolyard, Sarah was the first to offer help and to wipe their tears. My righteous indignation deflated at once. I put my hand on her back. Don't worry, sweetie. Please start your morning assignment for now. With a rustle of skirts I glided towards the door, chin raised. Speaking just loud enough for Mr. Taylor to hear, I said, "While I appreciate your guidance, Mr. Taylor, I have capably managed my students for years. Nurturing their sense of wonder and curiosity is vital at this age, and is not a distraction from an arbitrary curriculum." As he bristled, color rising along his sharp cheekbones, I felt an unexpected flutter of admiration. Up close, the stern Mr. Taylor had a startling magnetism about his countenance, deep-set brooding eyes, strong patrician nose, and an expressive mouth quick to frown yet beautifully formed. Clearly unaccustomed to having his authority questioned, particularly by a woman, he seemed briefly at a loss for words. My bold challenge had forced a crack in his stern demeanor, revealing the flustered man beneath. The ensuing silence swelled between us like an untamed thing, vibrating with an unexpected friction as our gazes locked in wordless assessment of each other. I saw the fire in his eyes shift from professional frustration toward personal intrigue as he looked at me. The intake of my own startled breath broke the tension. Gathering myself, I tilted my chin up boldly, ready to parry whatever sharp words spilled from his appealing mouth. A muscle ticked in his angular jaw. "We shall discuss this further at the appropriate time," he bit out. With a stiff nod, he spun on his heel and exited the room. I released a trembling breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Pressing a hand to my racing heart, I leaned against the wall. Never had I imagined Mr. Taylor's arrival would unleash such turmoil within these safe walls of my classroom, let alone my own heart. Yet as protectiveness for my students flooded my veins, so too had a reluctant awareness sparked to life. I'd have to watch myself with him, as I could easily fall into dangerous territory. Chapter 2. I rushed through the cobblestone streets of Harborview, my footsteps echoing sharply against the buildings alongside me. My breath came in short bursts, puffs of vapor trailing behind me in the chill spring air. I had left the school in a whirlwind after recounting my disastrous encounter with Mr. Taylor over and over inside my head. When the final bell rang, I barely paused to gather my things before fleeing the premises. The harsh scrutiny he had leveled at me still stung, and his stern voice cut through my normal jovial mood like a knife. How dare he criticize my methods, I fumed. I connected with my students, bringing joy and laughter into the classroom. His cold demeanor had no place around children. I slowed my pace as I neared the wharf, the rhythmic wash of waves against the pier helping to calm my frazzled nerves. Seaside Pages stood just ahead, a quaint corner bookshop owned by my dear friend Alice Thompson, who missed a certain dashing sea captain more than she cared to admit. If anyone could help me make sense of this calamity, it was her. A little bell jingled merrily as I stepped inside, the familiar canvas and cedar scent of the cozy bookshop enveloping me like a blanket. I had always felt at home among the crowded shelves and neatly organized displays that lined the walls. Today, their presence soothed my rumpled feathers. "Alice?" I called softly, stepping around a tall shelf bursting with leather-bound manuals. "Are you here? I'm afraid I've had the most distressing morning." Alice popped up from behind the front counter, her chestnut waves falling across her shoulders in a gentle cascade. Concern clouded her amber eyes as she registered my obvious agitation. "Tabitha! What on earth?" She bustled over, clasping both my hands gently in her own. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You look absolutely undone, my dear. Tell me everything." The sincere worry etched upon her delicate features broke the last bit of composure I had been clinging to. As we settled together on the plush lounge nestled next to the stove that was slightly warm from the morning's fire that had been allowed to go out, the entire woeful tale came pouring out. Alice listened to my concerns intently, interjecting now and then with an appropriate chuckle or murmur of understanding. My vision blurred with the threat of fresh tears as children brought me such joy, filling my heart even as that small nagging ache of loneliness lingered. How cruel for Mr. Taylor to question my dedication to their growth and education. "He was absolutely merciless, Alice," I bemoaned, dabbing at my eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Going on and on about decorum and propriety in the classroom. Honestly, that man might be good-looking but he's far too severe and I'm certain he has it in his head to dismiss me first thing tomorrow morning." Alice patted my hand gently. "Come now, Tabitha, with your reputation among the families here, they would chase Mr. Taylor," I supplied in a miserable tone.
Ah.
"Yes. Well, if Mr. Taylor so much as suggested your dismissal, the good people of this town would be upon him with pitchforks and torches." I managed a watery chuckle at the image. My reputation as a kind, energetic teacher was well known in our little community. As I began recounting fond stories of young Emily's first attempts at reading and how little Timothy finally overcame his struggles with arithmetic thanks to my patient guidance, the nervous tension coiled within my chest slowly unwound. Alice was quite correct, the family connections I held here ran far deeper than any transient administrator. Should this Mr. Taylor attempt anything to jeopardize my role, the good people of Harborview would swiftly unite to protect my position. The thought sent a swell of warmth through my chest. With staunch friends and little ones who depended on my instruction and care surrounding me, surely I could weather this minor squall. Alice must have sensed the shifting atmosphere, for her tone took on its familiar playful lilt. "Tell me, how long did it take for you to lose all sense once Mr. Tall Dark and Brooding crossed your threshold this morning?" "Alice." I swatted her shoulder with my handkerchief, unable to contain an embarrassed chuckle. Only she would dare tease me about the accursed headmaster and his vexing good looks, which I may have mentioned a time or two. Before long, twilight began to creep across the wharf outside. As I gathered my shawl and gloves, a new sense of hope and determination had taken root within me. I would face tomorrow's challenges with courage, bolstered by the support of loving friends. Drawing Alice into an affectionate farewell embrace, I promised to call again soon with an update on the state of affairs. Stepping out of the cozy bookshop onto the gaslit street beyond, the salty evening air filled my lungs with purpose. I would continue tending my little charges with patience and care, refusing to permit this Mr. Tall Dark and Brooding's interference to undermine the harmony of our cherished schoolhouse. And I would banish all thoughts of his good looks and any stomach flutterings he induced. They had no place in academia, and I would be darned if I allowed him to use his handsomeness to take me off guard again. Chapter 3. Later that week, as the last arithmetic problems were shuffled away and curious young eyes turned towards the clock, no doubt counting the minutes until they were free to race from the school, I decided a bit of levity was in order before their heads were crammed full with geography facts. Children needed to move and stretch, and I certainly could use a break. Who would like to learn a song and dance before lessons? I asked on a whim. A forest of small hands instantly shot skywards as a chorus of "Me, miss. Me," echoed around the room. Laughing at their enthusiasm, I cleared a space by my desk and mock curtsied before the impromptu class. "Well, Come along then. They lined up quickly. You start with 3 skips to the left, like so. I demonstrated enthusiastically as I sang. Oh, the cow jumped over the moon. As slick as a whistling loon. And the dish ran off with the spoon. On a sunny afternoon. Within moments, the room transformed into a mass flurry of flailing arms, stomping feet, and unrestrained merriment as children imitated my actions and picked up on the tune. Shrieks of carefree joy mingled with the steady creak of floorboards keeping rhythm for our dance. I laughed as Tommy made up a new line for the song. Sing song silly in the dell. The animals are feeling swell. Caught up leading the chain of prancing youths, in a serpentine through the desks, I failed to hear the heavy oak door groan open. Wrapped in our own world of innocent amusement, the sudden presence of such grim authority went unnoticed until that familiar stern voice called out. Ahem! What is the meaning of this? Spinning about, I found myself face to face with the imposing figure of Headmaster Daniel Taylor. Or, more accurately, face to top button as I had to lift my chin to take him in. I froze in place, which stopped the dancers. Gaiety still echoed through the classroom, several girls twirling in their calico dresses while the boys hustled to their desks. Mr. Taylor's piercing blue gaze swept the scene, one brow lifting sardonically. A productive use of scholastic time, I see. I lifted my chin. A brief moments of movement between lessons. I turned from him, feeling overwhelmed by his closeness. He was a presence to be certain, one that could not be ignored though I vowed to try. Back to your seats, I said merrily, determined not to let my internal shaking show. At my gentle reminder, the last few students slid behind their desks. Take out your maps and please start filling in all 38 state names. You can use my map on the board as a reference if you can't remember them. It was a big project and would take us several days to complete, but it was good to get them started. They'd learn the state capitals next year. Mr. Taylor remained ominously silent as he paced the classroom's perimeter with slow, steady footfalls. I struggled not to fidget as those intense eyes catalogued the students' projects displayed along the walls, painstakingly crafted dioramas of British naval battles, watercolor depictions of Puritan village life, a spinning orrery model of our solar system built from clock parts. He paused at the nature table where caterpillars crawled through glass jars, scrutinizing their green bodies. And these creatures, he flicked at one jar contemptuously, more frivolity, or a valuable expenditure of resources and time better applied to curriculum requirements. I eyed him levelly. Caterpillars transform Mr. Taylor. Just as eager minds do when nurtured. One dark brow quirked upwards even as sudden amusement lit his angular features. An interesting perspective, Miss Winslow. Though utterly insubordinate and ridiculous, of course. Several children gasped. He crossed his arms, those penetrating blue depths shifting from me to the avid faces of my students. I realized in that moment they were not simply observers, but participants in a silent battle of wills. Sudden fear swelled in my breast that my boldness had only placed them in jeopardy. If I was dismissed, which Mr. Taylor had every right to do, he would teach them until a new teacher was found, and that was not something I was going to allow to happen. Even if it meant eating humble pie. Smoothing my features into bland courtesy, I swept across oak planks worn smooth by generations of youthful feet. While we embrace learning through diverse means, core skills remain paramount. Perhaps you might suggest where our curriculum could be strengthened? For an eternal moment he searched my face, perhaps weighing the sincerity of my words. I held my body perfectly still beneath that piercing stare. To my astonishment, his angular features relaxed into wry acceptance tinged by grudging respect. A fair question. He offered me a slow nod which I returned graciously. Now, shall we discuss school operations or will you be hosting a cotillion this hour? I blinked. Was he teasing me? Surely not. But if not, then why did my stomach swoop and pulse quicken? My students have enough to occupy them for 20 minutes. Very good. I have questions. Shall we? He motioned for me to go ahead of him to my desk. I turned, taking the opportunity to dab at the moisture at my hairline. The man was a walking furnace that heated my very blood. Mr. Taylor conducted a rigorous inspection of my room, resources, and questioned my teaching practices. At times frustration swelled within me at his arrogant tone and demanding queries. Yet beneath the intimidating facade I sensed a keen mind sharpened by his own less-than-privileged upbringing. We were both products of tenement existence who'd painstakingly carved our way towards education and opportunity. This created an unspoken thread of commonality despite outward differences. At last he glanced at the long case clock ticking patiently near my desk and blinked. "Well now, I seem to have taken enough of your time for one day." He shuffled the copious notes he'd made. "I commend you for maintaining order and teaching standards under the limitations of aging facilities and minimal resources. I will take my leave and allow you." His gaze slid to the silent class, many of whom were still watching our exchange with obvious fascination. A ghost of a smile teased one corner of his mouth at a pair of particularly rapt faces. With a start I realized I'd ignored my students under the onslaught of his inspection. Guilt pierced me even as his approving tone soothed prior doubts about my teaching skills. Impulsively I touched his arm, turning so only he could hear my earnest words. "They're normally quite exuberant and chatty, truth be told. Thank you for noting my ability to maintain discipline during your inspection." I hesitated, then added softly. "Few comprehend the passion required to cultivate young minds." Might that passion live within him too? I searched his eyes for it, part of me wanting to find it more than a pirate searching for treasure. His gaze dropped to my fingers still resting on his black wool sleeve, his warmth seeping through to my skin. An electric moment stretched between us, his eyes slowly lifting back to mine. Abruptly he cleared his throat and gently extracted his arm from my light grasp. "Yes, well, carry on then." He hastened towards the hall, his long legs eating up the floorboards in seconds. But just before departing through the creaking door he half-turned, eyes glinting brightly. "I shall be back to continue our discussion. Good day, Tabitha." The door clicked shut behind him. A collective gasp escaped 36 small bodies before excited chatter erupted through the room at his use of my given name. But I stood fixed in place, deaf to their exuberance as I pressed one hand to my stomach to quell unexpected flutters. Daniel Taylor was undoubtedly an overbearing, ruthlessly efficient and entirely exasperating man. Yet that piercing gaze seemed to strip me bare, demanding nothing less than my deepest honesty and conviction. How was I to harness the anticipation now thrumming through my being at the prospect of our next encounter? Chapter 4. The next week passed swiftly as I immersed myself in lesson preparations, pushing the distressing, as it shall be called from this point forward, incident to the back of my mind. My students provided a happy distraction, their sweet faces lighting up each time I entered our little classroom. I almost believed the entire episode with the headmaster resolved until late one afternoon as I gathered the children's caps and coats to send them merrily on their way. A stern voice echoed from the entry hall, telling children to walk, not run, and scolding the boys for shoving one another. His voice came closer, sending a spike of alarm through my chest. "Good afternoon, Miss Winslow." Headmaster Taylor appeared in the doorway, tall frame silhouetted against the waning daylight. "Might I have a word?" I was caught quite off guard by how handsome he looked in his wool nathanet and pressed shirt. My pulse thrummed at an altogether distracting pace. Whatever could he want now? We'd established an unwritten, unspoken truce, he stayed out of my classroom and I stayed out of his office. It worked rather well, or so I thought until this moment. Smoothing my features into impassivity, I inclined my head in silent assent before turning to tidy the day's lessons on my desk. I would not permit him the satisfaction of witnessing the distress his presence evoked within me. He walked about the room, stopping to investigate new assignments hung on the wall to celebrate a child's improving penmanship or arithmetic. Silence reigned but for the minute sounds of slate scraping and books thudding softly into cubbies. When I could justify delaying no longer, I pivoted to face my tormentor with as much poise as I could muster. "You wish to speak with me, Mr. Taylor? Or was your curiosity over our caterpillar lesson getting the best of your good sense?" I teased. He jerked straight from where he'd leaned over to see the caterpillars were nearing the ELD of their pupa stage. He removed his hat, revealing a shock of dark waves that brought to mind lonely moors and craggy peaks. Stern features bore signatures of an inner conflict. He cleared his throat gruffly. Yes, well, that is. Uncharacteristic hesitation marked his gravelly voice. He ran a hand through his unruly locks before visibly gathering himself. It has come to my attention that my earlier condemnation of your methods was perhaps undeserved. I have since heard nothing but the highest praise for your skills in engaging our youngest and sometimes most rambunctious students. My shock must have registered plainly on my features, for he rushed to continue. In any case, I have been informed in no uncertain terms that I was over-hasty in questioning your dedication to these children's education and future success. He flushed and glanced away briefly, as though the memory of some recent tongue-lashing yet rang in his ears. Despite myself, I felt a reluctant grin begin to emerge. Oblivious to my growing amusement, the headmaster plowed ahead. Therefore, I have come to, that is, the purpose of my, he huffed out a breath, squaring his shoulders like a sailor bracing against a storm. I wish to apologize if my earlier words caused you undue distress, Miss Winslow. I am certain we shall have a productive working relationship moving forward. He extended his hand then, no doubt intending to punctuate his stilted olive branch with a cursory handshake. Later I would wonder what daring had seized me at that moment. Perhaps simply a desire to discomfit this overbearing man who had been the cause of such turmoil. Whatever the impetus, I found myself ignoring the proffered hand entirely. Instead, I fluttered long-lashed blinks up at his sternly chiseled features and allowed a sugary smile to curve my lips. Why, Mr. Taylor, how very gracious of you. I made certain to infuse the words with as much saccharine sweetness as possible. Let him stew on that. Gratifyingly, spots of color bloomed on his sharp cheekbones. He lowered the ignored hand to clutch at his vest pocket instead. Yes, well, propriety demands such things between colleagues. A breeze fluttered through the room then, carrying the bracing scent of the sea. Unruly locks fell across his furrowed brow, framing flashing sapphire eyes that belied the rigid set of his jaw. I ought to have been immune, having weathered that penetrating azure gaze just days prior. Yet something in his flustered countenance made him seem less threatening now, more mortal, and, much to my dismay, unexpectedly appealing. Clearing my suddenly dry throat, I turned to straighten the little chalkboard, if only to have something to do with my hands. Your courteousness does you credit, headmaster. And I will admit your assessment skills have improved markedly if you have indeed heard such accolades regarding my teaching. I cast a brief, sly glance over my shoulder, unable to resist one small barb. Perhaps you are not beyond hope after all. Something dangerous glinted in those azure depths. He stepped nearer, gaze intent. I assure you, madam, I am accustomed to excelling in any arena to which I apply myself. To my horror, I felt an entirely inappropriate flush begin to creep up my neck, only partly due to irritation. Merciful heavens, now he sounded as though. My fingers convulsed around the little chalk nub I held. Best redirect this conversation to safer waters. I gave a delicate sniff, turning to face him fully once more. Well then. I am certain between the two of us, our fair city's youth shall receive the finest tutelage Harborview has to offer. Holding his gaze, I allowed frost to seep into my tone once more. Now, if there is nothing else. Instead of taking my hint, the infernal man drifted closer still. Too late I realized my posture had become somewhat defensive. Chin lifted in challenge, back pressed to the solid edge of the chalkboard, fingers clenching white around that wretched chalk, I must have resembled a cornered feline. Daniel Taylor towered above me, a distractingly masculine figure exuding vigor and a boldness no decent woman should consider alluring. Merciful heaven, now I was the one flushing uncontrollably. This would not do. I jerked my gaze sideways, hoping my turmoil did not broadcast itself too plainly. Really, Mr. Taylor, it grows late. If you have said all you came here to say. Rough fingertips grazed the back of my hand then, startling me into meeting his gaze once more. The intensity there gave me pause. He truly was a dangerously magnetic figure. Silence hung between us, weighted and expectant. Then, seeming to recollect himself, the headmaster straightened abruptly. He pulled his wandering hand back to his side. "Yes, well, I shall take no more of your time this evening." As he moved to leave, I pressed trembling fingertips to my flushed cheeks in silent admonishment. What had come over me? Sinking into my chair, I watched his graceful movements in bewilderment. Pausing in the cloakroom doorway, he touched 2 fingers to his temple. "Good evening, Miss Winslow. Until we meet again." The door swept shut behind him with a note of finality, leaving naught but sweeping drafts and silence in his wake. I stared at the wood grain and wondered at the gleam in those sapphire eyes promising future tempests ahead. Chapter 5. The golden light of late afternoon filtered into the tidy schoolroom as I erased the remnants of the day's lessons from the chalkboard. Despite my students' departure over an hour ago, I had lingered. How quickly their bright, curious faces had come to feel like family. I sighed, replacing the nub of chalk in its tray. Tomorrow I would greet their smiles with customary enthusiasm regardless of the changes afoot. Glancing at the nearby harbor clock, I noted the hour with surprise. I should be getting home. As I gathered my things, footsteps echoed from the vestibule beyond my closed door, too heavy to belong to any lingering child. I stilled, pulse accelerating. It had been almost 4 days since our last encounter. Surely there was no reason on this earth that would bring the headmaster back to my room. Before I could bolt, the door swept open, revealing the last person I wished to see. "Good afternoon, Miss Winslow." Daniel Taylor's tall frame silhouetted by the honeyed light beyond. I hesitated, a confusing mixture of emotions swirling through me. Irritation was easy to identify. The hungry feeling for him, as if I had missed his presence, was harder to admit. I didn't want to spend more time with the headmaster than strictly required, and yet I'd found myself glancing in his office door as I passed, or craning my neck to catch a glimpse of him down a crowded hallway. Smoothing my hands over my skirt, I asked, "To what do I owe the pleasure of your company this afternoon, Mr. Taylor?" He removed his hat, sending unruly sable waves falling across his furrowed brow. Today he wore no suit coat over his waistcoat, just shirt sleeves rolled to reveal strong forearms. Too informal by far, I noted with a flare of irritation. Such attire hardly reflected his status nor inspired discipline in his subordinates. Clearing his throat, the headmaster met my gaze earnestly. "Miss Winslow, I have come to realize that, while the school is running well, even better than in years past." I held back my harumph of displeasure at his pride. "I'm not quite as involved as I would like to be." "Oh?" I furrowed my brow. "How involved do you plan to be?" He worried his hat brim between nervous fingers. "Might I assist you in some fashion? Lesson preparations for next term, perhaps?" I blinked, blindsided once more. The proud set of his jaw brooked no refusal. Here was a man unaccustomed to making requests. That he stood hat in hand, so to speak, willing to undertake clerical work far beneath his station bespoke more than his haughty nature had before. A tiny grin teased my lips unbidden. "Well, I do have a mountain of readers requiring fresh brown paper covers before week's end." One dark brow quirked upward even as his shoulders relaxed slightly. "It would be my pleasure to render what aid I can. Just tell me when and where." His evident relief at a chance to participate in classroom preparation squeezed unexpectedly at my heart. Tamping down the unfamiliar sentiment, I waved a hand to encompass the work table along the back wall. "I prepare them here in the mornings before lessons commence. You would be most welcome to assist." Glancing sidelong, I allowed a teasing lilt to enter my voice. "Unless such menial tasks lie beyond your credentials, Headmaster Taylor?" Something sparked in those indigo depths at my gentle goading, a glint of humor perhaps, or even wry appreciation. "Indeed not, Miss Winslow," he assured smoothly. "I shall prove myself worthy of the position my actions have not yet earned." I blinked in surprise. So he was undertaking a bit of humility to work his way into my good graces. Was that it? Had he done this with other teachers? I'd have to ask around, though doing so with delicacy was of the utmost importance. He bowed before donning his hat and moving toward the exit. Though I listened intently as his footsteps faded down the corridor, my pulse continued its unsteady rhythm long after the sound evaporated. Sinking into my chair with an unsteady exhale, I pressed fingertips to my flushed cheeks in silent admonishment. What had come over me? Alice would roll her eyes knowingly were she present to see me preening like a debutante receiving her first dance request. But honesty forced me to admit some hidden sliver of myself thrilled to see that formidable guard of professionalism crack, revealing hints of the man himself. The next weeks passed quickly as Headmaster Taylor made good on his offer, presenting himself early each midweek morning before the students' arrival. Indeed, he absorbed instructions on preparing readers and maintained a steady, meticulous pace without a word of complaint. Underscoring his natural affinity for order and process, he soon found ways to refine our modest bookmaking efforts for maximum efficiency. I watched with quiet admiration at times as those long ink-stained fingers deftly cut, aligned, folded and glued the young readers into serviceable covers. More than once I glanced up from my own miniature mountain of work to find his steady blue gaze resting thoughtfully upon me. Heat blossomed in my cheeks on those occasions, compelling me to seek urgent distraction in my task lest other reactions betray me as well. One morning, as we were working, I caught him smiling over a poem little Emily had penned the day before. "You seem to have adjusted remarkably well to the latest educational trends, Mr. Taylor. I thought traditional curriculums were your steadfast realm." "Even hardened veterans must occasionally wave the white flag of surrender," he replied with a glint in his eye. How could I resist when such a charming instructor stands before me so ardently championing her cause? I felt an undeniable blush creep into my cheeks at the flattering words barely concealed as academic interest. Our debates often took on such an undercurrent lately, neither of us willing to address this strange magnetism between us directly. Yet Daniel's piercing gaze followed me about the classroom more oft than necessary these days. "Well, I'm relieved my charm is strong enough to change even the most stubborn mind," I tossed back airily, holding his stare until we both ducked away. He picked up one of the children's art projects and scowled. "I still think geography skills should take precedence over any fanciful art projects," Daniel remarked, critically studying the student's colorfully painted map. I shot him a challenging look, ready to rattle off a response. But when I drew near to evaluate the amateur brushstrokes myself, an undignified snort escaped him. Glancing sharply over, I caught the absolute mirth sparkling in his eyes as he struggled to rein in his laughter. While Sarah's use of purple hills and orange oceans is creative, I fear any sailors relying on this nautical map would be in dire straits. He turned the paper towards me. A burst of shocked laughter leaped out before I could restrain myself at his impertinent observation. Clapping a hand quickly over my mouth as we stood shoulder to shoulder, my frame shook with the effort not to dissolve into wholly inappropriate giggles. Peeking upwards, I glimpsed Daniel's smug smile. I playfully smacked his arm. "You are a terrible man, to make me laugh at my students' earnest work," I whispered fiercely. "On the contrary," he countered, "I live now only to catch that delightful sound again." And as anger melted swiftly back to mirth, I realized perhaps that had been his aim all along. Chapter 6. In the bustling hallways and crowded classrooms, Daniel and I existed only as dedicated educators. When his tall frame darkened my doorway, I could almost convince myself the racing heartbeat and flushed cheeks were simply products of my enthusiasm for teaching. Surely the way his keen eyes softened in amusement at my vehement arguments or how his rich baritone sent shivers along my spine were natural responses any young woman might feel in the presence of such an intelligent, commanding man. Beyond these charged moments, our lives remained separate, divided by a chasm of social expectations. Despite the undeniable pull between us, I knew we could never be more than colleagues. Our heated debates and shared passion for molding young minds would have to be enough, for two souls with such different views could never hope to build a life together. The very idea was best left in the realm of girlish fantasy, I reminded myself sternly each time I caught my mind drifting to dangerous what-ifs. Better to cherish our spirited encounters within the schoolhouse as the fleeting gift they were than to long for impossible dreams. As I moved between the small desks, checking the progress of my students' penmanship, a soft cough caught my attention. Glancing up, I noticed little Amy hunched over her slate, her usually neat letters trailing off into a shaky scrawl. Frowning, I made my way to her side, gently placing a hand on her small shoulder. "Amy, dear, are you feeling all right?" I asked softly, bending down to meet her eyes. The child looked up at me with a wan smile, her normally rosy cheeks pale save for 2 spots of bright fever flush. "Yes, Miss Wells," she replied, her voice thin and raspy. "Just a bit tired." Unconvinced, I brushed a stray curl from her forehead, noting with alarm the unnatural heat radiating from her skin. Her brow was damp with sweat, yet she shivered slightly under my touch. "You're burning up, sweetheart," I murmured, my heart clenching with worry. "How long have you been feeling poorly?" Amy shrugged weakly, her glassy eyes struggling to focus on my face. She drew a breath and my own caught at the rattle that accompanied it. "Influenza." The word brushed through my mind like a cold wind through a cemetery. She laid her head on her desk, her eyes glassy. Our short conversation had drained her energy. Biting my lip against rising urgency, I glanced about to ensure my students were engaged in their work. Their heads were down and Tommy's tongue poked out the side of his lips as he concentrated. In the resulting quiet, chilling awareness descended. Even if I reached Amy's mother at her laundress job promptly, the wait for medical assistance could be dire given the child's rapid decline. Not to mention, I couldn't leave my class unattended. Perhaps there was no choice but to seek assistance. In the past, I would have gone to the headmaster. But I'd never sought Daniel out for help before lest he think less of me for not being able to handle my classroom. Glancing down at Amy's fur-ruffed and heated brow, I shoved my pride to the back of the classroom and marched into the hallway. It wasn't that I didn't want to see Daniel, it was that a part of me hated to have to ask for help. I was a capable teacher and a single woman who repaired her own roof, much to my neighbor's horror. And yet, I couldn't take care of my class and Amy at the same time. I hurried into the headmaster's office, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to catch my breath. Daniel looked up from his papers, surprise etched on his face as he took in my flustered appearance. "Miss Winslow, what's the matter?" he asked, rising from his chair. His assistant, Mr. Hathaway, did the same, sputtering about propriety and interruptions. "It's Amy," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "She's fallen ill during lessons. I've never seen a child's health deteriorate so swiftly." Daniel's brows furrowed with concern. "Where is she now?" "In the classroom, sleeping at her desk," I replied, wringing my hands. "She's burning with fever, and her breathing is labored." I didn't want to move her in such a state. Without hesitation Daniel rounded his desk. "Take me to her at once." As we hastened down the hallway, Mr. Hathaway following at our heels, I couldn't help but feel a rush of relief at Daniel's decisive action. He kept a firm yet gentle hand beneath my elbow, providing reassuring strength when my step faltered under the weight of so many relying on me. What if Amy was just the first to fall ill? What if this was an hour break and we had to close the school? What if one of them died? We entered the classroom to find Amy slumped over her desk, her small face flushed and glistening with sweat. The other children looked on with wide, frightened eyes, their usual chatter silenced by the gravity of the situation. Daniel leaned over her small form and spoke soothingly. "There now, let's have a look, little one." Rough fingertips brushed ginger strands from her blotchy cheeks before pulling a clean square of linen from his pocket to daub her face gently. "She's burning up," he murmured, his voice tight with worry. I nodded, blinking back tears. "I fear it may be influenza, headmaster. We must act quickly to prevent it from spreading." I whispered, hoping the other children wouldn't hear and become afraid. He softly brushed me aside and picked Amy up, cradling her head on his shoulder. His deep voice maintained steady encouragement and Amy responded instinctively, her mumbling already tapering to occasional deep sighs. I could have sagged in relief watching her little frame slowly relax against his broad shoulder. Tension ebbed from my neck as well under that familiar blue gaze. How instinctively Amy turned toward this stalwart man as though she had known his compassionate nature her entire life, when I was only just awakening to it. A powerful realization shook me then. No one else witnessed this patient and nurturing facet of Daniel's character. The gift felt unexpectedly intimate, intensifying the air between us. Issuing brisk commands for his assistant to summon Dr. McDermott, Daniel turned to me. I nodded once. I'll see to the other children and ensure they're sent home safely. As I ushered the students out of the classroom, Daniel began walking, gently swaying to help Amy feel more secure. Once every child had their lunch pail and a coat on, I walked them to the schoolyard and watched as they made their way home, praying for each of their health and then praying even more fervently for Amy's. When footprints were all that remained with me in the schoolyard, I made my way back inside. Fear for dear Amy clawed at my better sense and I hurried to Daniel, my palm touching her burning forehead. Gentle fingers slid beneath my chin, angling my face toward the light. Daniel studied me solemnly for breathless seconds before brushing wet trails from first one cheekbone then the next with a tenderness surely at odds with any detached professional concern. Hush now, he murmured, thumb lingering to trace my jaw with feather-light care. No need for tears when all will be well. His azure gaze, stripped of all barriers, held mine. Somehow through my distress, past vows of self-preservation gave way. Without conscious decision, I stepped into his steady strength, letting immediate sorrows drain away against a broad shoulder until muffled footsteps heralded another's more capable hands. Some barrier between us had quietly fallen in our shared worry over Amy's recovery. In this moment's intimacy, I glimpsed the devoted friend and compassionate man behind Daniel's aloof mask. My pulse skittered oddly. I hazarded a glance upward, unexpectedly arrested by admiration glowing plainly on his angular features. Something unfamiliar stirred inside me, an intoxicating blend of feminine pride and acute awareness of this compelling man barely a handspan away. I swayed infinitesimally closer, suddenly longing to touch the arrogant slant of his mouth curving faintly upward, as though he sensed my wayward reaction to his presence. What imaginings were mine to entertain of a respectable administrator? And yet, those stormy blue depths hovered so near, their intensity spelling my undoing. I stepped back deliberately, hoping distance and formality might restore my equilibrium, but Daniel advanced with lithe grace to close the gap between us once more. He caught my gaze boldly. Before conscious thought could reassert itself, his fingers grazed my wrist, setting my entire arm ablaze. Time fractured, perspective narrowing to those sea-glass eyes darkening subtly, the heat of his palm sliding down to envelop mine fully, his sharpening gaze lingering at my lips. The sound of a carriage out front sent us both springing back and laughing uneasily. He lifted a sleepy Amy easily against one shoulder, ushering me into the corridor where I determinedly reclaimed my professional decorum. As we walked, Daniel's free hand lingered lightly at my back, igniting sparks along my spine. What was happening between us? The doctor arrived and we were soon in the throes of diagnosis and then transporting Amy home. Daniel offered to hold her on the ride and the doctor agreed. They were swept away with the clattering of hooves and I was left feeling unsettled. I soon found myself at Alice's kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The events of the day had left me drained, both physically and emotionally, and I was grateful for the comfort of my friend's company. Alice bustled about the small kitchen, her usually cheerful face creased with concern. "You look exhausted, Tabitha," she said, setting a plate of biscuits before me. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been, seeing little Amy so ill. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. It was terrifying, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I've never seen a child so sick. And the thought of it spreading to the other students. I trailed off, shuddering at the memory of Amy's feverish form slumped over her desk. Alice reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "But you acted quickly," she reminded me gently. "You got her the help she needed, and thanks to you and Headmaster Taylor, I'm sure the worst has been avoided." At the mention of Daniel's name, I felt a strange flutter in my chest. I looked down at my teacup, suddenly fascinated by the swirling patterns of steam rising from the surface. "Yes," I said softly, "Headmaster Taylor was invaluable today. I don't know what I would have done without his support." Alice raised an eyebrow, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "It seems you two have been working together quite closely," she remarked, her tone laced with suggestion. I felt a blush creep into my cheeks, and I took a hurried sip of tea to hide my discomfort. We have a common goal, I said carefully, to ensure the well-being of our students. That's all. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't entirely true. Over the past few weeks, I had found myself increasingly drawn to Daniel's steady presence, his unwavering commitment to his duties. And today, seeing him kneel beside Amy's desk, his face etched with concern, I felt something stir within me that I couldn't quite name. Of course, Alice said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. But you know, Tabitha, not all of Harborview's most intriguing residents walk about with a sailor's gait. I nearly choked on my tea, my eyes widening in surprise that she would compare Daniel to her captain. Alice. I sputtered, setting my cup down with a clatter. What are you implying? She shrugged, a sly grin spreading across her face. Only that there's more to Headmaster Taylor than meets the eye. And perhaps, if you were to look a little closer, you might find something worth exploring. I shook my head, my heart racing at the very thought. He's my colleague, I said firmly, it wouldn't be appropriate. But even as I spoke the words, I couldn't help but wonder what it might be like to know Daniel as more than just a fellow educator. Alice leaned back in her chair, her expression softening. Life is short, Tabitha, she said gently, and love is rare. Don't let propriety stand in the way of your happiness. I sighed, my mind spinning with the implications of her words. Could there be something more between Daniel and myself? Something worth pursuing, despite the risks? As I sipped my tea and listened to Alice's gentle chatter, I couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, she was right. That somewhere beneath the layers of duty and decorum, there might be a spark waiting to be fanned into a flame. As I made my way home that night, my heart felt lighter than it had in years, buoyed by the possibility of what the future might hold. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps, with Daniel by my side, I might find the happiness I had always longed for. Chapter 7. As spring gales lashed our sturdy windows, eliciting delighted squeals from small children accustomed to nature's majestic fury, I found my gaze wandering with embarrassing frequency to the nearby administrative offices. When Mr. Taylor appeared unexpectedly across my threshold, I barely managed to smother my flustered reaction in time. He approached my desk with a determined stride, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me. Miss Winslow, he greeted, his deep voice sending an involuntary happy shiver down my spine. I find myself with a free period and thought I might offer my assistance. Is there a student in particular who could benefit from some extra guidance? I stared at him, momentarily speechless. In all my years at the school, I had never known the headmaster to take such a hands-on approach to teaching. Recovering my composure, I glanced around the room, my eyes falling on shy Beth Turner struggling with a poem composition in the back row. Beth Turner, perhaps, I suggested hesitantly, gesturing towards the young girl. She's been having difficulty with her creative writing assignments. To my shock, Daniel nodded decisively and strode directly for Beth. I watched, dumbfounded, as he pulled up a small chair alongside her, sat down, and leaned in, his usually stern features softening as he spoke in low, encouraging tones. As he worked with Beth, I couldn't help but marvel at the patience and kindness he displayed. Gone was the strict, unyielding headmaster I had come to know. In his place was a gentle, nurturing educator, coaxing halting sentences from Beth's downturned blonde head with a skill that left me in awe. Before departing some minutes later, Daniel cast an inscrutable glance my way, his eyes meeting mine across the room. I felt a flush rising in my cheeks, and I quickly looked away, pretending to busy myself with paperwork on my desk. But even as I tried to focus on my tasks, I couldn't shake the image of Daniel's large hands guiding Beth's small ones across the slate, his deep voice murmuring words of encouragement and praise. It was a side of him I had never seen before, and it left me feeling strangely unsettled. I found myself wondering what other surprises lay beneath Daniel Taylor's stern exterior. And despite my best efforts to quell the thought, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of excitement at the prospect of discovering them for myself. As the weeks marched into April's gentle embrace, Mr. Taylor's unexpected visits to my classroom became a regular occurrence. He would arrive without warning to help with arithmetic or listen to the children read. I wasn't the only teacher to receive his impromptu assistance, but I couldn't help feeling a secret thrill each time he appeared. I told myself the sparks I felt were merely from the static electricity of the woolen scarves we wore less often, and nothing more. Each year, our little school put on a Patriots' Day celebration in April. We invited the families to join us in remembering the brave men who fought for our freedom. This year marked the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and instead of our small celebration, the whole city was involved. I was in charge of the historical reenactment, which the older students would perform. There would be games, food booths and vendors, and fireworks that night. The day of our dress rehearsal had the students wound up and so excited regular lessons were forgotten. The sun was high in the sky, and the schoolyard was a hive of activity. The temporary stage stood proudly at one end, draped in festive red, white, and blue bunting that fluttered in the warm breeze. The air was filled with the excited chatter of children as they rehearsed their roles, the smell of fresh paint from the newly constructed set pieces, and the rustling of papers as teachers checked and double-checked their scripts rivaled that of the tree branches in a storm. I stood at the edge of the stage, watching the organized chaos with a sense of pride and excitement. The Patriots' Day celebration was always the highlight of our school year, and this year's performance promised to be the best one yet. The children had been practicing for weeks, perfecting their lines and movements until they could recite them in their sleep. But there was one crucial piece of the puzzle still missing. Mr. Hancock, our esteemed history tutor and the narrator of the play, had yet to arrive. He was usually so punctual, so reliable. I glanced at the large clock tower in the distance, frowning as I noted the time. He should have been here by now. I paced the length of the stage, my heels clicking on the wooden boards, trying to quell the uneasy feeling in my stomach. We couldn't start the final dress rehearsal without him. He was the backbone of the entire production, the one who tied all the scenes together with his rich, compelling voice and deep knowledge of the historical events we were portraying. Just as I was about to send one of the older students to check on him, I spotted a figure hurrying across the schoolyard towards me from the direction of his house 1 block from the school. As the person drew closer, I realized it wasn't Mr. Hancock at all. It was Miss Johnson, Mr. Hancock's neighbor, her face flushed and her expression grim. "Miss Winslow," she called out as she approached, waving a piece of paper in her hand. "I have some terrible news." My heart sank as I stepped down from the stage to meet her. The children had stopped their rehearsing and were watching us curiously, sensing that something was amiss. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is it Mr. Hancock?" Miss Johnson nodded, her eyes wide with sympathy. "I'm afraid so. He's had a terrible accident. He was rushing to get here and slipped on a patch of wet grass. He sprained his ankle quite badly. I'm afraid he won't be able to make it to the celebration at all. He's had to leave town to stay with his family while he recovers." I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications of her words sank in. No Mr. Hancock. No narrator. The very heart and soul of our play, gone. With the performance tomorrow, there was no time to find a replacement. The celebration would be a complete disaster. I looked out at the sea of young faces staring up at me, their expressions ranging from confused to worried to downright terrified. They had worked so hard, poured their hearts and souls into this performance. They deserved to have their moment in the spotlight, to feel the rush of pride and accomplishment that came with putting on a successful pageant. But how could we go on without Mr. Hancock? He was irreplaceable, his role too important to simply leave out. I felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on me, the knowledge that the fate of the entire celebration rested on my shoulders. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. I couldn't let the children see how worried I was. I had to be strong for them, to find a solution somehow. "Thank you for letting me know, Miss Johnson," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "I'll inform the teachers and we'll just have to figure something out." Miss Johnson gave me a sympathetic look and handed me the piece of paper. "This is the script Mr. Hancock was supposed to read from. I thought it might be useful." I took it with a grateful nod, my mind already racing as I tried to think of anyone who could possibly step in at such short notice. But even as I racked my brains, I knew it was hopeless. Mr. Hancock was one of a kind, his talent and knowledge impossible to replace. As Miss Johnson hurried away, I turned back to the stage. The children were still watching me, their eyes wide and anxious. I forced a smile onto my face, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. "Children," I said, clapping my hands to get their attention. "I have some rather unfortunate news. Mr. Hancock has had an accident and won't be able to join us for the celebration." A chorus of gasps and murmurs rippled through the group, some of the younger ones looking close to tears. I held up my hands for quiet, my mind still spinning as I tried to come up with a plan. "Don't worry," I said, hoping my voice sounded more assured than I felt. "We'll find a way to make this work. The show must go on, after all. Let's take a short break while I figure out what to do, and then we'll regroup and keep practicing. Everything will be just fine, you'll see." As the children dispersed, some huddling together to whisper anxiously, others kicking at the grass in frustration, I sank down onto the edge of the stage. Mr. Hancock's script felt heavy in my hands, the weight of all those carefully crafted words and historical details suddenly overwhelming. What were we going to do? How could we possibly put on the celebration without a narrator to guide us through? I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face and the gentle breeze playing with my hair. And then, suddenly, an idea began to take shape in my mind. A crazy, impossible idea, but one that just might work. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and excitement. Before I could second-guess myself, I hurried through the halls, my skirts swishing around my ankles, until I reached Mr. Taylor's office. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. When he finally opened the door, I was momentarily speechless. His usually impeccable dark hair, always neatly combed and parted, was now tousled and falling into his eyes. It was as if he had been running his fingers through it repeatedly, a sign of stress or deep concentration. His eyes, those piercing blue orbs that could make even the most confident person feel exposed, widened slightly in surprise at seeing me standing there. I couldn't blame him, it was rare for anyone to disturb him in his office without an appointment. And I seemed to be making a habit of it. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was an air of authority about him. His broad shoulders were squared, his posture straight and proud. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms. His dark vest and trousers were impeccably tailored, hugging his lean frame in all the right places. But it was the little details that caught my eye, the things that most people might not notice. The faint shadows under his eyes, the slight crease between his brows, the way his jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. These were the signs of a man under pressure, a man with the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, the silence stretching between us. My heart pounded in my chest, my palms grew damp with nervousness. I had begun to admire Mr. Taylor, respected his intelligence and dedication to his work. But seeing him like this, slightly vulnerable and caught off guard, made him seem more human somehow. He cleared his throat and stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. "Miss Winslow," he said, his deep voice sending a shiver down my spine. "What catastrophe has brought you to my door?" Catastrophe? I noticed my breath coming in quick gasps, as if I'd run to the harbor and back though I'd only traveled inside from the schoolyard. I swallowed hard past the dryness in my throat. As I brushed past him, I caught the faint scent of his cologne, a subtle blend of sandalwood and spice. It was a scent I had come to associate with him, one that always made me feel oddly comforted and unsettled at the same time. The office was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn against the bright sunlight outside. The air was thick with the smell of old books and polished wood, a scent that I had always found strangely comforting. Mr. Taylor's desk was a massive oak monstrosity, piled high with papers and ledgers. The bookshelves lining the walls were filled to bursting with thick tomes, their spines cracked and faded with age. As I took a seat in the chair opposite his desk, I couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. I was here to ask for his help, to beg him to step in and save the Patriots' Day celebration from disaster. But what if he refused? What if he thought it was beneath him, a waste of his time? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to meet his gaze. Those blue eyes seemed to see right through me, to pierce the very heart of my being. But there was something else there too, a flicker of concern, of curiosity. And so, with my heart in my throat and my hands trembling slightly in my lap, I began to explain the situation, to pour out my fears and hopes and dreams for the celebration. I could only pray that he would understand, that he would be willing to help us in our hour of need. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, or more likely, within me, that some invisible barrier had been breached. And as he listened intently, his eyes never leaving my face, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. For in that moment, I realized that Mr. Taylor was more than just a colleague, more than just a respected authority figure. He was a man, a flesh and blood man with his own hopes and fears and dreams. And somehow, in spite of everything, I found myself wanting to know more about him, to unravel the mysteries that lay beneath that stern exterior. It was a dangerous thought, one that I knew I should push away. But as he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk and his fingers steepled thoughtfully, I couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement, a sense that anything was possible. And so, with my heart racing and my mind whirling with possibilities, I waited for his answer, knowing that whatever he decided, nothing would ever be the same again. One of his dark eyebrows arched up, and I saw a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. I fear for my sanity if I were to agree to this. The teasing gleam in his eyes made me feel a little less guilty. If you happen to have a talent for historical oration, I believe you shall do just fine. I held my breath. When he still paused, I blurted. Please, Mr. Taylor Daniel. The children have worked so hard and I cannot bear to let them down. It would be a disappointment and tragedy in their young lives. Mr. Taylor lifted one eyebrow at my dramatis. Are you certain you are not up to a spirited reading? I shook my head vehemently. He stood and stepped over to the coat rack and grabbed his coat. Providence seems determined to test me, he said with a sigh. Lead the way, then. Let's see if we can avert total disaster. Despite his words, his tone was lighter than I'd anticipated and I grinned up at him. His returning smile warmed me through to my toes. I led him out to the schoolyard, where the children were gathered on and around the stage. The younger ones giggled and chased each other around the bunting-draped poles, while the older students milled about nervously. Mr. Taylor approached the podium at the front of the stage, looking slightly ill at ease. All right, then. What am I meant to say? I hurried over to him, handing him the pages and giving his shoulder an encouraging squeeze. I'm certain you'll do splendidly, Mr. Taylor. Half measures don't seem to be in your nature. I gave him a heated look which made him blink in surprise. I turned to the children, clapping my hands and hiding my flushed cheeks from Daniel. Places, everyone. We're ready to begin. As Daniel began to read, his rich baritone voice washing over us, my mouth fell open in awe. The children were transfixed, hanging on his every word. I could almost smell the smoke of the battles, hear the crack of musket fire, feel the passion of the revolutionaries in my bones. When he paused for the colonial and British forces to take their places, I approached the podium, intending to offer a word of encouragement. But the look on his face stopped me in my tracks. He seemed lost in memory, a mix of surprise and wonder in his eyes. You're a natural at this, I said softly, resting my hand on his shoulder. Did you study elocution as a child? He glanced up at me, startled out of his reverie. I did, actually. My tutor, Mr. Adams, was a dear friend of the family. My mother aspired me to be a politician, you know? Something in the way his eyes dropped to the papers and his shoulders folded in told me of his loss. My heart ached for him, seeing the vulnerability beneath his stern exterior. I couldn't help myself, I reached out and cupped his cheek, my thumb brushing over his stubbled jaw. She would be so proud of the man you've become, I whispered. Something flickered in his blue eyes, something raw and painful and beautiful. But before I could say anything more, he cleared his throat. Yes, well. Shall we continue? His eyes darted to the other teachers and I was painfully aware of the liberty I had taken in front of praying eyes and wagging tongues. I backed away, feeling the heat of a blush creeping up my neck. What had come over me? I busied myself with straightening the children's costumes, trying to ignore the way my heart raced. I was so busy with the pageant that I hadn't a moment to think and barely enough time to eat that day. Thankfully, that meant I didn't have much time to ponder over my interaction with Daniel. If I could just stay that busy forever, I might not have to be embarrassed about touching his cheek. The morning of the pageant dawned bright and the schoolyard was a flurry of activity. Families arrived with baskets of food, handmade flags, and excited children. The air was filled with the tantalizing aroma of freshly baked apple pies and roasted meats, mingling with the crisp scent of the spring breeze. The sound of laughter and chatter echoed across the grounds, a joyful symphony that lifted my spirits and eased my nerves. Amidst the chaos, I caught glimpses of Mr. Taylor in the crowd, his tall form easy to spot. He moved with a kind of graceful authority, his broad shoulders squared and his head held high. He was dressed impeccably as always, in a tailored suit of deep blue that brought out the color of his eyes. As he greeted families and shook hands with the other teachers, I couldn't help but admire the way he carried himself, the confidence and poise that seemed to come so naturally to him. But it wasn't just his appearance that caught my attention. Whenever I glanced in his direction, I found his eyes already on me, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. It was as if he was trying to puzzle me out, to understand the thoughts and feelings that lay beneath my carefully composed exterior. The weight of his gaze made me feel both exhilarated and unsettled. I found myself caught in a haze of unfocused thinking about him when I should have been straightening the chairs or checking on the programs. These feelings were dangerous to the carefully constructed life I balanced as a career woman. They could lead to nothing but heartache and ruin. Mr. Taylor was my superior, a man of authority and influence. To even consider a romantic attachment was foolish, a risk that could jeopardize everything I had worked so hard for. And yet, I couldn't seem to shake the fluttering in my stomach whenever he was near, the way my heart raced when he spoke my name. It was as if some invisible force was pulling me towards him, even as my rational mind screamed for me to run in the opposite direction. The pageant started on time and proceeded without incident. I watched my students perform their Yankee Doodle song with such enthusiasm that it brought prideful tears to my eyes. When the last echoes of the musket salute faded away and the audience burst into applause, I felt a rush of pride. We had done it, despite the odds. As I was congratulating the children, a mother approached me, her green eyes twinkling mischievously. Well, Miss Winslow," she said, fanning herself dramatically. I never thought I'd see the day when Mr. Taylor would participate in something so frivolous. And with such good humor, too. If you're not careful, you'll have some competition for his affections. I felt my face flush hot with embarrassment. Mrs. Trent, surely you don't mean to imply. It's not like that at all. Mr. Taylor chose that moment to appear at my elbow. He glanced between Mrs. Trent and me, no doubt sensing the awkwardness. Mrs. Trent smothered a laugh as Mr. Taylor's expression turned sober. "Good afternoon, ladies," he said stiffly. "I hope you have a pleasant holiday." He turned to go, but hesitated, looking back at me. "You did well today, Miss Winslow. Your guidance has clearly had a positive impact on the children." I nodded, unable to find my voice as a sudden lump formed in my throat. Mr. Taylor's praise, so rare and hard-won, meant more to me than I cared to admit. But before I could respond, he took a step closer, his voice lowering so that only I could hear. "Miss Winslow, I wonder if you might do me the honor of accompanying me on a walk along the path by the sea." My heart leapt into my throat at his unexpected invitation. A walk? With Mr. Taylor? Alone? The very idea sent a thrill of both excitement and trepidation through me. I glanced around, suddenly aware of the curious stares and whispers of the families and teachers still milling about the schoolyard. Mrs. Trent's knowing smile had grown wider, her eyes sparkling with mischief. I began, my voice trembling slightly. Chapter 8. As I hesitated, torn between propriety and the allure of the unknown, I became acutely aware of the curious gazes and hushed whispers surrounding us. Well, Mrs. Trent murmured, just loud enough for me to hear. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks as I glanced around, noticing the pointed looks and barely concealed grins. It was clear that everyone had drawn their own conclusions about the nature of my relationship with Daniel, and the thought of being the subject of such gossip made my stomach churn. But as I turned back to Daniel, taking in the earnest expression on his face and the gentle curve of his proffered arm, I realized that he too was aware of the implications, and he forged ahead. To have asked me in such a public manner meant that he was making a statement, a proclamation that he was interested in me as more than an educator. His bravery was intoxicating. Steeling myself, I reached out and placed my hand on his arm, feeling the solid warmth of his muscles beneath the fabric of his coat. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through my body, igniting a spark. As we turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Trent's face, her eyes wide with surprise and a touch of envy. Our departure together would only fuel the rumors and gossip. Let them talk, I thought fiercely. Let them speculate and wonder. With Daniel's arm steady beneath my hand, I allowed him to guide me away from the schoolyard and towards the winding path that led to the sea. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore grew louder as we walked, a soothing rhythm that seemed to echo the pounding of my own heart. I couldn't help but feel a sense of nervous anticipation. My mind raced with thoughts of what he might say and why he'd singled me out. Finally Daniel cleared his throat, breaking the stillness between us. "Miss Winslow," he began, his voice slow and earnest. "Tabitha. There's something I need to tell you." I glanced up at him, my heart fluttering in my chest. The way he said my name, with such tenderness and reverence, sent a shiver down my spine. "Yes, Daniel?" I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. He stopped walking, turning to face me fully. His blue eyes were intense, filled with a mixture of uncertainty and determination. I felt myself getting lost in their depths, my own eyes searching his for any hint of what was to come. "I know that our relationship has been professional up until now," he said, his words careful and measured. "But I find myself unable to ignore the feelings that have been growing within me." My breath caught in my throat, my pulse raced as I waited for him to continue. "Your kindness, your intelligence, your passion for teaching, everything about you captivates me," Daniel admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I know that it may seem sudden, and I understand if you don't feel the same way, but I had to tell you." I stared at him, my mind reeling with the implications of his words. Daniel Taylor, the stern and respected headmaster, was captivated by me? "Daniel," I breathed, my voice trembling slightly. I don't know what to say." But even as the words left my lips, I knew that they were untrue. I knew exactly what I wanted to say, what my heart longed to express. He reached out, taking my hands in his own. His touch was gentle, his fingers calloused. The feeling of his skin against mine sent a jolt of electricity through my body, igniting a flame that had been smoldering within me for longer than I cared to admit. "Say that you'll allow me to court you," he murmured, his eyes searching mine. "Say that you'll give me a chance to prove myself worthy of your affections. I know that I may not be the most romantic or expressive man, but I promise to cherish and respect you, to support you in all that you do." My heart felt as though it might burst with the overwhelming emotions that consumed me. Joy, relief, and a sense of rightness that I had never experienced before. "Yes," I whispered, a smile spreading across my face. "Yes, Daniel, I would be honored to have you court me." The words felt natural, as if they were always meant to be spoken aloud. His answering smile was brilliant, transforming his usually stern features into something soft and warm. He lifted my hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to my knuckles. The sensation of his mouth against my skin sent a shiver through my entire being, a promise of the intimacy and passion that lay ahead. "Tabitha," he murmured my name, his voice thick with emotion. Without conscious decision, I stretched upward on tiptoe until my hands curled lightly around the solid warmth of his neck, thumbs tracing taut sinews until tension slowly evaporated. My own pulse hammered wildly at such intimate contact. His large hands slid appreciatively along my arms before coming to rest curled loosely at my waist. My belly tightened involuntarily. He bent slowly to press his lips against mine in a soft, promissory kiss. Molten joy surged through my veins at this intimacy. An incoherent murmur escaped his throat as I withdrew slowly. Heart overflowing, I cradled his magnificent face between gentle palms, hoping tender expressions conveyed even a fraction of what words could not. We stood there for a long moment, gazing into each other's eyes as the world around us faded away. In that instant, nothing else mattered but the two of us, the connection that had blossomed, and the promise of a future that stretched out like an endless horizon. I was awed by my own reaction. I had always been content with my role as a teacher, finding fulfillment in nurturing young minds and shaping the future. But now, with Daniel, I realized that I had been missing something vital, a piece of myself that I hadn't even known was absent. As we turned to continue our walk, our hands intertwined and our hearts beating in sync, I couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder and excitement over what this meant for our futures. Chapter 9. I didn't see Daniel at all that weekend. Nor did I see him in school on Monday. And I missed him terribly. The reality of that was hard to bear as I was used to being a solitary creature existing in her own sphere. But now I lived with the anticipation of Daniel's arrival. Thankfully, he appeared in my classroom shortly after final bells signaled dismissal that afternoon. The very air vibrated with my racing heart as I watched him stride confidently between the desks to the board where I stood, nerves balanced tenuously between anticipation and anxiousness to learn how events would unfold between us. Daniel paused just out of reach, lines of tension framing his mouth though his sapphire eyes blazed intensely. "I hope my presence causes you no undue distress, Miss Winslow?" My lips curved involuntarily despite a fluttering pulse. How characteristic that he would question propriety even after clandestine moments exposing our deepest longings. I stepped closer. "Daniel, please. No need exists for such formality outside of the public." Shoulders loosening subtly, he touched my hand before moving to wander about my room. I left him to private musings, returning silently to grading the day's arithmetic worksheets I had abandoned earlier in helpless distraction. Productivity proved futile with Daniel's restless energy expanding to fill every corner like incoming tide. Stealing glances through my lashes, I hardly noticed the task before me. Eventually Daniel turned from perusal of handmade flowers thumbtacked haphazardly across one wall, catching my poorly masked scrutiny. "If I am such a pleasant sight, you have but to request extended viewing rather than stealing glances, my dear." His inflection dropped suggestively. "We could relocate nearer to enable you to study in greater depth." The heat rising in my cheeks intensified, and I found myself at a loss for words. His bold flirtation, laced with tantalizing innuendo, sent my heart racing and my mind reeling. I knew I should respond with a witty retort, something to match his playful banter, but my tongue seemed to have tied itself in knots. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I met his gaze with a coy smile of my own. "Why, Mr. Taylor," I began, my voice soft and teasing, "perhaps you could enlighten me with an in-depth study." I let my words hang in the air between us, a challenge and an invitation all at once. The spark in his eyes told me that he understood my meaning, and I felt a thrill of excitement course through my veins as he moved to my side. "Perhaps." He moved nearer still, trailing his fingers across the desktop until grazing against mine. "Though attracting your particular attentions, Miss Winslow, requires extremely dedicated effort." He traced down my temple and across my jaw. My pulse leapt beneath his wandering touch. What unseemly instincts this otherwise respectable man ignited so effortlessly? Gripping my poor pen fiercely, I mustered a glance. "Your campaign for my attentions shall prove lengthy, I imagine, Mr. Taylor. I require meticulous attention." He threw back his head then and laughed delightedly, permitting glimpse of long-buried humor surfacing readily in my company. Joy fizzed through my veins at the realization I myself brought some happiness into his life. It seemed only natural to reach for his large calloused hand and draw it gently to my lips for a soft kiss as laughter faded into surprised pleasure. When my gaze lifted hesitantly to his once more, brilliant azure sparkled with delight of shared discovery. I experienced love's euphoria for the first time. Daniel cradled my cheek lightly within his broad palm. "Indeed, I believe eternal siege may perhaps seem too short. If besieging heaven is so exquisite." His seductive words tightened my lungs and ignited blissful anticipation coiling outwards, ever outwards from the place his fingers still rested against my face. I leaned imperceptibly into their welcomed caress. Tender joy bubbled up as I contemplated how many sunsets we had yet to watch twining together. Had ever a courtship begun with such sweet promise? His kiss was tender and full of joy, tentative yet possessive in nature. Over subsequent weeks Daniel crafted opportunities for us to interact away from prying eyes. A chance meeting along secluded harbor pathways allowed me to slip my arm through his as we walked. Carriage rides into hillside forests found my hand nestled securely within his larger one. And stolen moments working late in shadowy administrative offices permitted ever bolder exploration of mutual desire through stolen kisses freely given. Had life ever been this full? This happy? And dared I trust it to continue? Chapter 10. The cheery aroma of lavender and chamomile tea enveloped Alice, Margaret and I as we gathered around the worn oak table tucked into the corner of Sullivan's fine hats. Margaret's hazel eyes danced merrily while regaling us with the latest town gossip and the story of a would-be thief stopped by the local police. Her dainty hands nimbly stitched emerald velvet trim onto a lady's top hat. Pausing her work suddenly, she peered at me over the unfinished masterpiece. "You seem rather distracted today, Tabitha. That's the third time you've stared off into nothingness instead of delighting over these latest Parisian ribbons I acquired." Her brown ringlets bobbed as she studied me. "Come now, tell me what weighs so heavily on that heart of yours." I managed a watery chuckle, busying my restless hands folding and refolding my shawl. "Oh, it's nothing really." I avoided their kindly gazes. Gentle fingers covered mine, stilling their anxious movements. I lifted hesitant eyes to Alice's compassionate smile. "We are your dearest friends, so confide freely." She gave an encouraging nod. "Is this about your courtship with Headmaster Taylor?" I let out a sigh, nodding slowly. "It's just. I've been hearing some rather unpleasant rumors circulating about our relationship." Margaret's brows furrowed in concern. "Rumors? What kind of rumors?" I felt my cheeks heat with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. "Some people have been suggesting that I'm only courting Daniel to advance my own position at the school. That I'm using him for personal gain." Alice's eyes widened in shock. "How dare they? Anyone who knows you at all would realize that's complete nonsense." Margaret reached out to squeeze my hand, her expression fierce. "Those wagging tongues should be ashamed of themselves, spreading such vicious lies. You are the most sincere and genuine person I know, Tabitha." I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, touched by their unwavering support. I know I shouldn't let the gossip affect me, but I can't help but worry. What if it damages Daniel's reputation? What if the school board starts to question his judgment? These fears had kept me up for nights, ever since Mrs. Trent said the very thing to my face. I'd been so confounded that I didn't form a good response. She took that as admitting guilt and now I wallowed in the mud pit of misery and regret. Alice shook her head firmly. "Daniel is a grown man, fully capable of making his own decisions. If he has chosen to court you, it's because he cares for you deeply. He won't be swayed by a few petty rumors." Margaret nodded in agreement. "Tabitha, my dear, you mustn't let the opinions of others dictate your happiness. If being with Daniel brings you joy, then that is all that matters. Those who truly care about you will support your choice, and the rest can hang." Alice's eyes sparkled with mischief. "And if anyone dares to question your propriety, just remind them of the time Captain Nathan and I were caught kissing on the pier in broad daylight. The scandal nearly set the town ablaze, but we weathered the storm together. And now, they've moved on." I couldn't help but smile at the memory. Alice and Captain Nathan's kiss after he'd nearly drowned at sea was the talk of the town for weeks. It wasn't the actual kiss that divided the town. Half the residents felt a woman should have the right to kiss her man after such a harrowing experience and the other half thought they should have waited until they were indoors. "You're right, Alice," I said softly. If you and Nathan could face down the judgment of the entire town and come out stronger for it, then surely Daniel and I can do the same. Margaret grinned. That's the spirit, Tabitha. And besides, anyone with eyes can see how smitten the headmaster is with you. When he gazes at you, it's like he's basking in the warmth of the sun after a long, cold winter. I felt a blush creep up my neck at her words, my heart fluttering at the thought of Daniel's affection. It was true, the way he looked at me sometimes, it made me feel cherished, adored, like I was something precious and rare. Alice reached out to pat my hand. Don't let the small-minded gossips of this town dim your light, Tabitha. You and Daniel have something special, something worth fighting for. Hold on to that, and everything else will fall into place. I took a deep breath, letting their words sink in. They were right. I couldn't let the idle chatter of others sway me from the path I had chosen. Daniel and I had something real, something true. And I would face down any challenge, any obstacle, to protect and nurture that love. Thank you, both of you, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I don't know what I would do without your friendship and support. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. Oh, hush. That's what we're here for. The tension in the room easing as we fell into our usual easy camaraderie. And as we sipped our tea and chatted about the upcoming governor's ball, I couldn't help but feel a sense of hope and excitement for the future. Because no matter what the wagging tongues of the town might say, I knew in my heart that Daniel and I were meant to be together. And with the love and support of my dearest friends, I knew I could weather any storm that came our way. I only wished the storm hadn't blown in so quickly. Chapter 11. The morning sun streamed through the tall, arched windows of the schoolhouse, casting a warm glow on the wooden desks and the well-worn chalkboard. I hummed softly to myself as I arranged a vase of fresh wildflowers on my desk, their delicate petals a cheerful contrast to the somber portraits of Washington and Lincoln that hung on the walls. I moved to the hallway to greet my students and found Mrs. Trent, her face pinched with righteous indignation, marched towards the headmaster's office, her husband in tow. She wore a high-necked, navy blue dress that rustled with each determined step, the heavy fabric a stark contrast to the delicate lace collar that framed her severe features. Her graying hair was pulled back into a tight bun, not a single strand out of place, and perched atop her head was a small, dark hat adorned with a single white feather that quivered with each forceful movement. Her hands, clad in pristine white gloves, clutched a small, black reticule, the beaded accessory swinging in time with her purposeful strides. Mr. Trent followed closely behind, his own expression a mix of discomfort and resignation. His dark suit, though well-tailored, seemed to hang on his lean frame, as if the weight of his wife's determination was physically bearing down on him. He adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles nervously, his gaze darting between his wife's back and the door of the headmaster's office. My stomach clenched with unease, a feeling that had become all too familiar in recent weeks. Mrs. Trent's vendetta against me had been steadily growing, her disapproval of my relationship with Daniel morphing into a full-blown campaign to discredit me. I had seen the way she watched me during church services, her eyes narrowed in silent judgment, and how she whispered behind her hand to the other ladies of the congregation, no doubt sharing her unfounded suspicions. It seemed that no matter how hard I tried to maintain a sense of decorum and professionalism, Mrs. Trent was determined to find fault in my every action. She had made it her mission to paint me as a woman of loose morals, a temptress who had seduced the headmaster for her own gain. The very thought of her accusations made my cheeks burn with indignation and shame I hadn't earned. I knew that her hatred for me stemmed from a deep-seated jealousy, a resentment of the happiness I had found with Daniel. Mrs. Trent herself had always struck me as a deeply unhappy woman, her life a series of social obligations and appearances rather than one filled with true joy or purpose. Perhaps, in her own twisted way, she believed that by destroying my reputation, she could somehow elevate her own standing in the community. Whatever her reasons, the constant threat of her malice hung over me like a dark cloud, tainting even the most innocent of interactions with an undercurrent of fear and anxiety. I could only pray that Daniel and I would find a way to weather this storm, to prove to Mrs. Trent and the rest of the town that our love was pure and true, untainted by the vicious rumors and speculations that seemed to follow us at every turn. I stepped out of my classroom just in time to hear Mr. Trent's booming voice, his tone dripping with accusation. Completely inappropriate. A woman of her reputation should not be allowed to teach our children. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. Anger flared within me, hot and fierce. I walked into the headmaster's office, my head held high, just as Daniel was responding to the trance. He stood tall and imposing, his broad shoulders filling out his impeccably tailored suit. The rich, dark fabric accentuated his athletic build, hinting at the strength that lay beneath. His chiseled features were set in a look of fierce determination, his strong jawline clenched in quiet defiance of the accusations leveled against us. Daniel's usually neatly combed hair was slightly tousled, a single lock falling rakishly across his forehead. The effect only served to enhance his dashing appearance, lending him an air of rugged handsomeness that made my heart skip a beat. His piercing blue eyes, framed by long, dark lashes, flashed with a mixture of anger and protectiveness as he faced down our accusers. "Mr. Trent," he said, his voice low and dangerous, each word carefully enunciated. "I will not stand for such baseless accusations against Miss Winslow. She is an exemplary teacher and a woman of unimpeachable character." As he spoke, Daniel's strong, yet elegant hands gripped the edge of his desk, the tendons in his forearms flexing beneath the crisp white fabric of his shirt. The sight of him, so powerful and commanding, sent a thrill of admiration and desire coursing through my veins. Despite the gravity of the situation, I couldn't help but feel a sense of safety in his presence. Daniel exuded an aura of unwavering strength and determination, a steadfast resolve to protect not only his own honor but mine as well. The set of his broad shoulders and the square of his jaw spoke volumes about his character, a man who would not be cowed by the petty machinations of small-minded individuals. As he continued to address the trance, his rich baritone voice filled the room, each word imbued with a quiet intensity that commanded attention. The passion and conviction in his tone left no doubt as to the depth of his feelings for me, and the lengths he would go to defend our love. In that moment, I felt a rush of love and gratitude for the remarkable man who stood before me. Daniel's unwavering commitment to truth and justice, his willingness to risk everything for the sake of our happiness, only served to deepen my admiration and respect for him. He was, in every sense of the word, my hero, a dashing and noble figure straight out of the romantic tales. Mr. Trent scoffed, his face reddening with indignation. "Unimpeachable character?
Ha!
The entire town has seen the way you two carry on, with your secret meetings and longing glances. It's a disgrace." I flinched as if I had been struck, my eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Daniel stepped forward, his broad shoulders squared and his head held high. "Mr. Trent, you have crossed a line. Miss Winslow and I have conducted ourselves with the utmost propriety, and I will not have you slandering our names with your baseless gossip." Mr. Trent's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "We shall see what your superiors have to say about that, Headmaster Taylor. Mark my words, I will not rest until this impropriety is exposed and dealt with accordingly." With that, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, Mrs. Trent following close behind. She paused in the doorway, casting a smug, triumphant look at me before disappearing into the bright morning light. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my shaky breaths. Daniel was already at my side, his hands gently cradling my face. The warmth of his touch was a soothing balm to my frayed nerves, his presence a steadfast anchor amidst the tempest of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. "Tabitha," he murmured, his voice soft and soothing, a melodic whisper that caressed my very soul. "I won't let them tarnish your name. I would sooner resign my post than see you suffer for our love." His words, so full of conviction and devotion, caused a fresh wave of tears to spring to my eyes. I leaned into his touch, my eyes fluttering closed as a single tear escaped down my cheek. The gentle brush of his thumb against my skin wiped away the errant droplet, a tender gesture that spoke volumes about the depth of his affection. "Daniel, I can't bear the thought of you losing everything because of me." My voice wavered, thick with emotion as I voiced the fears that had been haunting me since Mrs. Trent's accusations first came to light. The idea of Daniel sacrificing his reputation, his very livelihood, for the sake of our love was a burden almost too heavy to bear. He shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You are everything to me, Tabitha." As he spoke, Daniel drew me closer, enfolding me in his strong arms. I melted into his embrace, my cheek pressed against the solid warmth of his chest. I could hear the steady beat of his heart, a soothing rhythm, the unwavering strength of his resolve. We stood there for a long moment, drawing strength and comfort from each other's presence. Daniel's hands traced soothing circles on my back, his touch a gentle reminder of the unbreakable bond that existed between us. As the tension slowly ebbed from my body, I tilted my head back to meet his gaze, my eyes searching his for any hint of doubt or hesitation. All I saw reflected in those mesmerizing blue depths was a fierce determination and an unwavering love that took my breath away. Together, I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. We'll face whatever comes, as long as we have each other. Daniel's smile widened, his eyes crinkling at the corners in that way I adored. Always, my love. Always. Chapter 12. 2 long and exhausting weeks passed, each day bringing a new wave of gossip and speculation. The whispers seemed to follow us wherever we went, the sidelong glances and hushed conversations were a constant reminder of the scandal that had rocked our small community. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting with bated anticipation for the next juicy tidbit of information to fuel the rumor mill. At times, the weight of the gossip felt almost unbearable, a suffocating blanket of judgment and condemnation that threatened to smother the very joy from our lives. I could feel the eyes of the townspeople on me wherever I went, their gazes ranging from pitying to scornful, from curious to outright hostile. But through it all Daniel and I held our heads high, our love and loyalty unwavering in the face of adversity. We drew strength from each other, our bond growing stronger with each passing day. In stolen moments between classes, we would meet in the quiet of the headmaster's office, our hands intertwined. I love you, Tabitha, Daniel whispered, his forehead pressed gently against mine. No matter what they say, no matter what they think, that will never change. His words, so full of conviction and devotion, were a balm to my weary soul, a reminder that our love was something precious and rare, something worth fighting for. When the whispers grew too loud, we would seek solace in each other's company, taking long walks in the countryside or sharing quiet moments in the sanctuary of Daniel's office. During these moments, we would talk of the future, of our dreams and aspirations. We would imagine a life filled with love and laughter, with children of our own and a home to call our own. These dreams, so vivid and tangible in the warmth of each other's presence, gave us the strength to carry on. And as the weeks turned into a month, we began to notice a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the town. The whispers grew less frequent, the glances less pointed. It was as if, slowly but surely, the people of Harborview were beginning to see the truth of our love, the purity and sincerity of our devotion to each other. Perhaps it was the way we carried ourselves, with quiet confidence and unwavering resolve. Or, maybe it was that we didn't hide away but boldly took meals together in public and continued to walk along the seaside path, greeting those we met along the way. Or perhaps it was the light of our love shining through, even in the midst of adversity, a beacon of hope and inspiration to all who witnessed it. Whatever the reason, we found ourselves surrounded by a growing circle of support, of friends and allies who believed in us. And then, on a misty Tuesday morning, a stranger arrived at the schoolhouse. He was a distinguished-looking gentleman, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. I watched from the window of my classroom as he greeted Daniel with a firm handshake and disappeared into the school and then Daniel's office. An hour passed, each minute feeling like an eternity. I couldn't focus on my lessons, my mind consumed with worry. My hands trembled as I wrote on the chalkboard, my usually neat script reduced to a shaky scrawl. I could feel the eyes of my students on me, their curious gazes noting every hesitation, every nervous glance towards the door. I tried to compose myself, to put on a brave face for the sake of my charges, but the fear that gnawed at my insides refused to be quelled. My mind raced with 1,000 terrible possibilities, each one more dreadful than the last. What if the Trents had succeeded in their cruel campaign? What if their vicious rumors and baseless accusations had poisoned the minds of those in power, turning them against us? The thought of Daniel being forced to resign, his reputation in tatters, was almost too much to bear. And what of my own position? If the board believed the lies being spread about me, about us, would they see fit to dismiss me from my post? The idea of being cast out, of losing the job that had given my life such purpose and meaning, filled me with a sickening dread. As the minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness, I could feel the tension in my body mounting, my muscles coiled tight with anxiety. My stomach churned, a nauseating mix of fear and uncertainty that left me feeling weak and lightheaded. I paced the length of the classroom, my skirts swishing against the wooden floorboards. My fingers twisted together, the skin turning white with the force of my grip as I tried to hold back the tide of panic that threatened to engulf me. Every sound from beyond the classroom door set my nerves on edge, my heart leaping into my throat at the thought that it might be news of our fate. The distant murmur of voices, the creaking of floorboards under heavy footsteps, each one seemed magnified, a portent of the judgment to come. And still, the minutes crawled by, each one an eternity of uncertainty and dread. I felt as though I was standing on the edge of a precipice, waiting for the ground to crumble beneath my feet and send me plummeting into the abyss. Just as I was about to give in to despair, the office door opened, and the two men emerged. To my surprise, they were both smiling. The gentleman tipped his hat in my direction, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. I rushed into Daniel's office, the door closing behind me with a soft click. "Daniel," I breathed, my voice trembling with emotion. "What happened? What did he say?" Daniel's arms came around me, his hand stroking my hair with a tenderness that made my heart ache. "It's all right, my love," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "Everything is going to be all right." I pulled back slightly, searching his face for any sign of doubt or hesitation. But all I saw was a brilliant smile, his eyes alight with relief and joy. "The superintendent, Mr. Blackwell, came to investigate the rumors," Daniel explained, his thumb brushing away a stray tear from my cheek. "But he saw through the lies. He knew that the Trents' accusations were baseless, nothing more than petty jealousy and spite." My heart soared at his words, a burst of happiness so intense that it left me feeling giddy and lightheaded. "So, it's over?" I whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "We're safe?" Daniel nodded, his smile widening. "Yes, my love. We're safe. Mr. Blackwell made it clear that our positions are secure, and that he has no intention of giving credence to such vicious rumors." I let out a breathless laugh, my arms tightening around Daniel's neck as I pulled him closer. "I can't believe it," I murmured, my lips brushing against his. "I was so afraid, Daniel. I thought." He silenced me with a kiss, his lips warm and soft against mine. "I know," he whispered, his forehead resting gently against my own. We held each other close, our hearts beating in unison as we savored the moment. The relief, the happiness, the sheer joy of knowing that our love had triumphed over adversity, it was almost too much to bear. "I love you, Daniel," I whispered, my fingers tracing the curve of his jaw. "I love you more than I ever thought possible." His eyes shone with a devotion that took my breath away. "Now and forever, you are every beat of my heart." We stayed like that for a long moment, lost in each other's embrace, in the warmth and comfort of our love. And when at last we parted, our hands still clasped tightly together, I knew that nothing could ever tear us apart. As Daniel walked me back to my classroom, I knew that our love would endure, a shining example of the power of true devotion and unwavering faith. Chapter 13. As we strolled hand in hand during a secluded springtime hike, the warm breeze carried the sweet fragrance of wildflowers and the earthy scent of the forest. The sun dappled the path before us, casting a golden glow on the lush green foliage. Daniel's hand rested protectively around mine, his touch both comforting and electrifying. The gentle pressure of his fingers sent a shiver down my spine, and I found myself leaning into his embrace, savoring the solid strength of his body. Our goal was a sprawling oak tree, its branches reaching out like welcoming arms. We'd picnicked here a couple weeks ago and vowed we would soon return. Daniel halted our steps and cleared his throat. The sudden change in his demeanor caught my attention, and I looked up at him, my heart fluttering. His expression hovered oddly between tentative joy and uncertainty, a rare vulnerability in his usually confident facade. The way his brow furrowed and his lips parted slightly made my breath catch in my throat. "Tabitha," he began, his voice low and earnest, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." My pulse quickened, and I felt a tingling sensation spread from my chest to my fingertips. Could this be the moment I had been dreaming of? Daniel took a deep breath and got down on one knee, his blue eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my knees weak. "Might you do me the very great honor of accepting my hand?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. Overwhelming emotion cascaded through my soul, a torrential rush of joy, love, and disbelief. This splendid, indomitable man who had unexpectedly illuminated the shadows haunting my existence now envisioned a lifetime's partnership with me. It seemed too good to be true, a miracle I hardly dared to trust. But as I gazed into his beloved face, I saw the sincerity and adoration shining in his eyes. The way his lips curved into a hopeful smile, the way his hands trembled slightly as they held mine, every detail etched itself into my memory. Unable to find the right words, I simply lifted my hands to cradle his face, pulling his smiling mouth to meet mine in a kiss that spoke volumes. His lips were soft and warm against my own, his touch gentle yet passionate. I poured all of my love, all of my happiness, into that kiss. As we parted, Daniel let out a breathless laugh, his eyes sparkling with joy. "I'll take that as a yes, then," he teased, his thumb brushing across my cheek. "Yes, 1,000 times yes," I whispered, my heart soaring with elation. Amidst the emerald sprigs and birdsong, our promises mingled joyfully between kisses both ardent and playful. Daniel's strong arms encircled me, holding me close as he peppered my face with sweet, fleeting kisses. The scent of his skin, a heady mix of sandalwood and something uniquely him, filled my senses, making me feel giddy and lightheaded. He slid the betrothal band onto my waiting finger, and I marveled at the way it caught the sunlight, the delicate metal warming against my skin. No jewels could compare to the radiant happiness I felt in that moment, the certainty that our love was true and everlasting. All uncertainties faded into obscurity beneath the glorious sunlit rays pouring down upon us, a blessing from the heavens above. As I cradled Daniel's face between my palms, I knew that this was just the beginning of our journey together. No doubts remained of our shared destiny, a path that had begun in this remarkable hour and would lead us to a lifetime of love and happiness. With a final, lingering kiss, we set off. The future stretched out before us, bright and full of promise, and I knew that with Daniel by my side, anything was possible. Chapter 14. Joy welled within as I beheld our lace-wrapped cottage with roses blooming in the dawn light. To think this haven now awaited our family, small still yet so ardently wished for. I inhaled sweet perfumes of spring, Daniel's arms encircling my swollen belly protectively. His whiskered chin nuzzled my shoulder. "Just think, beloved, soon this home will echo tiny footfalls." My heart constricted with love. Oh, after endless trials finding safe harbor together, to wake each dawn knowing dedicated partner and precious little one awaited seemed gift so undeserved. As dandelion spores danced on warm breezes around us, Daniel cradled my cheeks, joyful devotion reflecting back at me. I clung tightly to his steadfast warmth, envisioning a little boy whose features surely mirrored his father's kindness. Soon tiny hands would link our own while we showed him delights of crashing surf and fluttering gulls. Daniel claimed my mouth tenderly, then lovingly traced my cheekbone in awe. Immense understanding passed silently between us, of covenants woven irrevocable from that very first searing glance just 1 year ago. Ancient mariners navigating solely by celestial patterns knew no deeper resonance than our twined hearts pulsing in time. Our haven shone bright through ink-black nights, and love's beacon remained ever fixed.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the story of Tabitha and Daniel, and I wanted to let you know that I am working on Margaret's story now. It involves a very brave police officer. I'm really excited about it. So I will have that to you as soon as possible. Subscribe so that you're made aware every time I upload a new book. Please remember that you are loved, and thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next video.